A man told me I couldn't possibly understand politics. I'm literally the mayor. After 3 terms as mayor, I'd gotten pretty good at blending into charity events without my security detail. And when a man in an expensive suit asked what I did, I just said I worked in local government. Robert's eyes lit up like I'd just admitted I couldn't read, and immediately started explaining how lucky I was to have found any job in the public sector, since they usually only hired women to fill quotas. He guessed I was probably answering phones or organizing someone's calendar, and when I mentioned working closely with the mayor's office, he laughed and said, "Oh, honey, making coffee and taking notes isn't really working with the mayor, but I'm sure you're very good at organizing his schedule." I took a sip of wine instead of correcting him because this was about raising money for sick kids, not my ego. He started explaining how city government worked while massaging my shoulder, telling me that women didn't understand that real decisions got made in back rooms between businessmen who ran things. When I tried to politely give him my 2 cents, he put his finger to my lips and said, "Sweetheart, I've been studying politics since before you were born, so listen more and talk less because this is probably all going over your pretty little head." The hospital's director was watching nervously, and I knew any drama would overshadow the fundraising. His friend Chris joined us, and Robert introduced me as this sweet girl who thinks she understands politics because she files papers at City Hall. Chris asked if I brought them coffee during meetings, and when I said no, he guessed I must water the plants. They both started explaining how women's brains weren't wired for leadership, and I kept my face neutral because Chris was a major donor. Robert grabbed my phone when it buzzed with a text from my deputy about tomorrow's press conference, reading it out loud in a mocking voice and saying I was adorable for playing pretend government with my work friends. He scrolled through my messages while Chris looked over his shoulder, making comments about how I probably had a crush on my boss because women in politics were just looking for powerful men to marry. When they saw a message about city ordinances, Robert patted my head and said those big words were too complicated for me to understand. Then Robert pulled up an article about how cities run by women always fail because females make emotional decisions instead of logical ones. Chris nodded along, saying the women getting elected was why America was falling apart. They nodded, saying women should stick to teaching and nursing where maternal instincts were useful, instead of pretending they understood budgets and laws. And I just smiled because we were 3 donors away from our goal, and that's when I could finally cause drama. Robert grabbed my wrist, pulling me closer, saying that women voters were ruining the country by voting for whoever promised free stuff or had charming smiles instead of understanding actual issues. Then he described his ideal candidate who would put women back in their proper roles and stop wasting taxpayer money on daycare and maternity leave that encouraged women to abandon families. And I focused on the auction paddle in his other hand with a $50,000 bid. Chris asked if I'd ever met the mayor, and Robert answered for me, saying someone at my level would never get FaceTime with important people unless serving drinks or taking dictation. He explained the mayor was probably some beta male who hired women to look progressive, but secretly knew they were incompetent, which explained the city's problems. They listed everything wrong with our city that I'd actually fixed during my terms, giving me credit for nothing while explaining how a real man would handle things differently. Robert squeezed my shoulders, describing how he'd run the city, how he'd fire all diversity hires and replace them with real talent, meaning men who'd earned their positions instead of checking boxes. He said the current mayor was probably too busy with photo ops and feelings-based initiatives to understand that women in leadership made America look weak to other countries. Then he grabbed my face with both hands and delivered the line that made my blood boil. "You're too pretty and sweet to waste your time pretending to. Understand man's work when you could be home raising the next generation of leaders, which is the only real contribution women can make to society." The lights dimmed just as his hands were still cupping my face, and the event coordinator stepped up, announcing it was time for the keynote address, asking everyone to welcome their mayor to the stage. I pulled away from Robert's frozen hands and walked past his dropped auction paddle, taking the microphone as 300 people applauded, and I looked directly at Robert's pale face before saying, "Good evening, everyone. I'm going to stray a bit from my prepared remarks tonight, because I just had the most educational conversation with 2 fine gentlemen." Everyone turned to stare at them. I gripped the microphone tighter and scanned the whole room slowly, making sure everyone could see exactly where I was looking. The spotlight swung around, following my eyes, and landed right on Robert and Chris, who were still frozen by their table. Robert's face went from white to pink to deep red as 300 pairs of eyes turned to stare at him. His hand was still hanging in the air where my face had been, and he slowly lowered it while people started whispering. I cleared my throat and smiled at everyone. "First, I want to thank all our amazing donors tonight for supporting the Children's Hospital." The crowd relaxed a bit and some people clapped, but most kept glancing between me and Robert. "Your generosity makes such a difference, and respect and professionalism are what make these events successful." I paused and looked directly at Robert again. "Unfortunately, some people tonight showed us exactly what we don't want at city events." The whispering got louder, and I saw several people pulling out their phones. Just now, someone grabbed my phone without permission and read through my private messages. Gasps came from different parts of the room, and more heads turned toward Robert's table. They also touched my face without my consent while explaining their views. The room went completely quiet except for the sound of ice clinking in someone's glass. Chris was staring at his shoes while Robert kept opening and closing his mouth like a fish. These actions would be wrong from anyone, but they're especially troubling when paired with comments about women being unfit for leadership. Several women in the crowd started nodding, and I heard one woman near the front say something to her husband. The person said women's brains aren't wired for leadership and that we should stick to making coffee. More gasps, and now people were openly staring at Robert, who was trying to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. I shifted my weight and softened my voice. But tonight is about the children who need our help, not about bad behavior. The hospital director's shoulders dropped with relief from where he stood by the auction table. I'm asking everyone here to help us exceed our fundraising goal while treating all staff and volunteers with the dignity they deserve. People started clapping again, louder this time. Every person here, regardless of their job or gender, deserves basic respect. I looked around the room one more time. That's why I'm announcing tonight that the city will be developing new standards for behavior at all city-sponsored or partnered events. The applause started slow with just a few people, but then spread through the crowd. I noticed several older men near the back weren't clapping and were shaking their heads. These standards will ensure everyone can participate safely and professionally in our community events. More applause, and several women were actually standing up now. Thank you all for your continued support of this wonderful cause. I stepped away from the microphone and walked toward the side of the stage. The room split into different reactions as I came down the steps. Most people were clapping and smiling at me, but I saw several donors shooting angry looks at Robert and Chris. The auctioneer hurried up to the microphone and awkwardly tried to get the program back on track. Well, let's continue with our auction items. Robert still hadn't picked up his paddle from where it had fallen on the floor. The hospital director rushed over to me backstage with sweat on his forehead. Mayor, I appreciate you handling that, but can we please keep the rest of the evening smooth? His hands were shaking slightly. The fundraiser is my priority, I told him while my own hands were trembling from adrenaline. Good. We're so close to our goal. He kept glancing back at the main room where people were still talking in groups instead of paying attention to the auction. I walked back to the edge of the room where I could see everything. Robert and Chris were hunched over at their table, both scrolling through their phones and not looking at anyone. My own phone started buzzing nonstop in my hand. Text after text came in from my staff who were watching the live stream from home. My deputy sent 5 messages in a row asking if I was okay and saying she was already drafting talking points. I glanced up to see Robert typing furiously on his phone while Chris whispered something to him. Neither of them would look in my direction. A woman in a dark blue dress walked over to me quietly. Mayor, I want you to know I'll cover any donation gap if there's backlash from what just happened. She touched my arm gently. Robert did something similar to me at a medical conference last year. My stomach tightened. He cornered me by the bar and kept touching my shoulders while explaining how women doctors were too emotional for surgery. She shook her head. I was too scared to say anything because he funds our research wing. I looked back at Robert, who was now standing up and gathering his coat. Thank you for speaking up, she continued. Someone needed to. She pulled out her checkbook. I'm doubling my donation tonight. Chris stood up too, and they both started walking toward the exit without looking at anyone. People moved out of their way, and several women gave them cold stares as they passed. The auction continued in the background, but half the room was still watching Robert and Chris leave. My phone kept buzzing with more messages from council members, reporters, and staff members who had seen what happened. The hospital director appeared next to me again. They're leaving, he said, and I couldn't tell if he was relieved or worried about losing their donations. I walked over to where Robert had been standing and picked up my phone from the floor. The screen was still unlocked and showing my messages. My deputy had sent 12 texts in the last 5 minutes asking if I was okay, and saying she was already drafting talking points for tomorrow's press conference about workplace boundaries and professional respect. The messages kept coming in faster than I could read them. She'd already pulled together 3 pages of notes about appropriate behavior at city events. I scrolled through quickly and saw she'd CC'd our communications director, who was suggesting we focus on policy rather than personalities. My hands were shaking a little as I typed back that I was fine and we'd talk later. The hospital director was still hovering nearby, watching me with worried eyes. I slipped the phone into my pocket and looked around the room one more time. People were still talking in small groups and pointing toward where Robert and Chris had been sitting. The auction was continuing, but nobody was really paying attention anymore. Several women came up to me as I walked toward the exit and squeezed my hand or touched my shoulder without saying anything. Their faces told me everything I needed to know about their own experiences. I made my way through the crowd slowly and deliberately without looking back at Robert and Chris's empty table. My security detail was waiting by the door, and I could tell from their expressions they'd been watching the whole thing on the live stream from their phones in the lobby. The lead officer opened the door for me without saying anything, and we walked out together into the cool night air. My driver had already pulled the car around and was standing by the back door. He told me he'd heard some of what Robert said when he'd come out for a smoke break earlier. I got into the car and immediately pulled out my phone to start recording voice notes while everything was still fresh. I dictated every single thing I could remember, starting with Robert's first comment about women only being hired to fill quotas. I included the exact time we'd started talking and listed everyone I'd seen nearby who might have witnessed parts of the conversation. I described how he'd grabbed my phone without permission and scrolled through my private messages. I noted the specific comments about women's brains not being wired for leadership and how we make emotional decisions instead of logical ones. My driver confirmed he'd definitely heard the part about women being too pretty to waste time on men's work when he was standing by the valet stand. I kept dictating for the entire 20-minute drive home, including every time Robert or Chris had touched me without permission. By the time we pulled into my driveway, I had 43 minutes of audio notes covering everything from the shoulder massages to the face grabbing. Later that night, around 11 p.m., I was on a conference call with my deputy and our communications director going through everything that had happened. My deputy had already watched the live stream footage 3 times and time-stamped every problematic moment. The communications director kept emphasizing that we needed to focus on systemic change rather than making this about Robert personally. We agreed our messaging would center on establishing professional standards for all city-partnered events going forward. My deputy suggested we announce a new code of conduct at tomorrow's press conference instead of dwelling on tonight's incident. We spent 2 hours mapping out talking points that would advance the policy conversation without getting bogged down in personal drama. The communications director warned that Robert would probably try to spin this as me overreacting to innocent conversation. We decided to let the video speak for itself, rather than getting into a he said, she said situation. By 1 a.m, we had a solid plan that protected the hospital's fundraising, while still addressing what happened. I finally got to bed around 2 but couldn't sleep because my phone kept buzzing with notifications. Someone had posted a clip from the live stream on Twitter, and within 3 hours my office account was tagged in over 400 comments. The reactions were completely split, with half the people praising me for speaking up, and the other half saying I'd ruined a charity event to score political points. The video kept getting shared and reshared, with different people adding their own commentary. Some women were sharing their own stories about similar experiences at professional events. Men were arguing in the replies about whether Robert's behavior was actually inappropriate or just old-fashioned. By morning, the local news had picked it up, and my inbox had 57 media requests. A reporter from the biggest paper in the city emailed asking for an exclusive interview about the incident for tomorrow morning's edition. I stared at the request, trying to decide if going on record would help establish the need for better professional standards or just make everything about me personally. My deputy thought we should stick to the press conference, but the communications director felt we needed to control the narrative before Robert's side got out there. While I was still debating what to do, my phone rang with a call from the hospital board president. He wanted to meet privately to discuss how we could align our messaging going forward. He admitted what happened was completely inappropriate, but he was worried about damaging relationships with major donors. He suggested we meet for coffee that afternoon to figure out a path forward that protected the hospital's mission. I agreed to the meeting but made it clear I wouldn't be backing down from addressing the behavior. Next, my city attorney called with a warning about potential defamation claims if we named Robert directly in any statements. She recommended we focus on describing behaviors rather than calling out individuals when we talked publicly. She'd already started researching precedents for workplace harassment at charity events. Her advice was to document everything formally, but keep public statements focused on policy solutions. She suggested we frame everything as creating better environments for all participants, rather than punishing specific people. I spent the morning drafting a formal complaint to file with the hospital about the unwanted physical contact and the privacy violation when Robert grabbed my phone. The complaint created an official record without making it personal or vindictive. I listed specific behaviors and their impact on my ability to participate in the fundraising event. I included witness names and noted that video evidence existed of several incidents. The hospital would have to investigate and respond officially, which would create documentation if Robert tried to claim nothing inappropriate happened. Around noon, my deputy rushed into my office with her laptop showing me a statement that Robert's company had just released to the media. They claimed I was politicizing a charity event for personal gain and creating controversy where none existed. The statement didn't deny anything specific but framed the whole thing as a misunderstanding that I'd blown out of proportion for political points. They said Robert had simply been making friendly conversation, and I'd chosen to take offense because I needed attention. My phone started ringing with calls from 2 city council members who never liked me much anyway. They wanted me to apologize for making the fundraiser about myself instead of sick kids. The first one said I'd turned a charity event into a political stunt and threatened to block my upcoming budget proposals if I didn't make this right. The second one called 5 minutes later saying basically the same thing but adding that I'd embarrassed the whole city. I realized this was going to become a political fight whether I wanted it or not. My deputy brought me lunch while I started typing an op-ed about setting basic boundaries at civic functions. I focused on creating safe environments for everyone, rather than rehashing what happened last night. The piece talked about respect and professionalism without naming anyone specific. I saved the draft and sent it to legal for review before publishing anything. The city attorney would need to check every word to make sure we didn't open ourselves up to lawsuits. Around 2 o'clock, an email came in from the Women's Labor Coalition offering their full support. They'd been watching the live stream and had dozens of similar stories from other events. The coalition president said they were ready to back any policy proposals I brought forward about workplace respect. She mentioned they had 3,000 members who'd experienced similar treatment at professional events. Her email included testimonials from women who'd been grabbed, talked down to, or had their phones taken at work functions. She said they'd been waiting for someone in power to finally address this stuff publicly. My security team knocked on my door with worried looks on their faces. They'd flagged an anonymous email that came through the general city email system. The message referenced the charity event and made threats about what would happen if I kept pushing this issue. They'd already forwarded it to the police and wanted to increase security protocols for all my upcoming appearances. The head of security recommended having 2 officers with me at all public events for the next few weeks. I agreed, even though I hated needing protection just for doing my job. My communications director came in with a stack of papers outlining our press conference strategy for tomorrow. We'd announce a new code of conduct proposal instead of dwelling on last night's incident. The focus would be on systemic improvement, rather than personal grievances. She'd drafted talking points that emphasized creating professional standards for all city-partnered events. The proposal would include training requirements and clear consequences for violations. We'd frame it as protecting everyone, not just women, from inappropriate behavior at public functions. The next morning, I stood at the podium in the press room with cameras rolling. I announced citywide standards for behavior at any event the city sponsored or partnered with. The new rules would require all attendees to respect personal space and privacy. Organizations wanting city partnerships would need to provide training on appropriate conduct. Violations would result in removal from events and potential loss of city contracts or partnerships. I explained that last night's incident showed we needed clear guidelines to protect all participants. The reaction online split exactly how we expected it would. Supporters shared their own stories about being harassed at work events. Critics accused me of grandstanding and making everything about gender when it wasn't. Some people said I was being too sensitive, while others said I wasn't going far enough. The important thing was that people were finally talking about professional boundaries at civic events. My phone buzzed with a text from the hospital fundraising chair asking for a private meeting. He showed up at my office an hour later looking stressed. He asked if we could smooth things over to protect future fundraising events. I explained that accountability and successful fundraising weren't mutually exclusive. He said he understood but worried about losing donor support if this controversy continued. I told him that donors who only gave money if they could harass staff weren't donors worth keeping. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair and admitted several women had complained about Robert before. Nobody had done anything because he gave so much money to the hospital. I asked him to put those complaints in writing for our records. He agreed, but looked worried about the implications for the hospital. Later that afternoon, the donation data came through from last night's event. The fundraiser had actually exceeded its goal by $20,000 after my remarks. Several new donors had stepped up with larger contributions after watching what happened, but 3 major donors were threatening to pull their future support if I didn't apologize. The hospital board was torn between relief at meeting their goal and concern about future events. They scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss how to handle donor relations going forward. 2 days later, my assistant handed me an official-looking envelope that had been delivered by courier. Robert had filed an ethics complaint with the city ethics board alleging I'd misused my office. He claimed I'd used my position for a personal vendetta and damaged his reputation without cause. The complaint forced me to document everything formally, which meant hours of paperwork. My team had to pull security footage, gather witness statements, and create a timeline of events. The city attorney said we'd need to preserve all emails, texts, and phone records related to the incident. This was going to consume city resources that should be used for actual city business. Robert's lawyer had crafted the complaint carefully to make it sound like I'd planned the whole thing. They claimed I'd deliberately concealed my identity to create a confrontation for political gain. My city attorney walked into my office the next morning carrying 3 thick folders and a laptop, setting everything down on my desk with a heavy thud. She pulled out a timeline chart showing every step we'd need to take over the next 6 weeks to respond to Robert's complaint. We spent 2 hours going through each document, making copies of everything from the event livestream to witness contact information. She marked which papers needed to be preserved for potential litigation and which ones we could use publicly. Her assistant brought in more boxes of files related to city event policies going back 5 years. We had to prove this wasn't some personal vendetta, but a legitimate policy concern that affected multiple events. She kept checking her watch because she had another meeting, but stayed to help me understand exactly what Robert's lawyer was trying to do. The complaint alleged I'd deliberately hidden my identity to embarrass him, which meant we needed witnesses who saw him grab my phone and face without knowing who I was. She made a list of everyone who'd been standing nearby during our conversation. My deputy knocked and entered with printed screenshots from social media showing people discussing what they'd witnessed. The attorney grabbed a highlighter and marked the posts that could serve as evidence. She warned me this would eat up dozens of hours of staff time that should go to actual city business. Her phone rang and she answered it, then handed it to me saying a reporter wanted a statement. The reporter had already talked to 3 people who'd been at the fundraiser, and they all confirmed hearing Robert's comments about women's brains. I gave a brief statement about focusing on policy solutions rather than personal disputes. The article went live within an hour, shifting some public opinion, though Robert's business associates immediately posted rebuttals claiming the witnesses were biased because they supported me politically. Chris decided to release his own evidence that afternoon, posting an audio clip on his company's website. He'd apparently been recording on his phone, though he'd edited out most of the conversation to make it seem innocent. The clip still included him asking if I water plants at City Hall, which didn't help his case much. My tech team called me down to the basement where they'd been working with the venue's AV equipment. They'd managed to recover the full audio from the sound system that had been recording for the live stream. The file clearly captured Robert grabbing my phone and his comment about women's brains not being wired for leadership. We made 3 backup copies and locked the original in the city's evidence safe rather than releasing it publicly. My deputy thought we should post it immediately, but the attorney advised keeping it as leverage. A prominent business leader called my office that afternoon offering to mediate between all parties. He suggested we could avoid months of legal battles if everyone signed a mutual non-disparagement agreement and moved on. I listened to his proposal while reviewing the draft agreement his lawyer had already prepared. The document would prevent me from discussing the incident publicly or pursuing any policy changes related to it. I thanked him for his efforts but explained that signing would mean other women would face the same treatment at future events. He tried arguing that quiet resolution would be better for everyone, especially the hospital's fundraising efforts. I declined any settlement that included a gag order or required me to apologize for addressing the behavior at the event. Some problems needed public attention, not private agreements that let harassers avoid consequences. The City Council scheduled a hearing for the following week about my proposed code of conduct for city-partnered events. Several council members were already expressing skepticism about adding what they called unnecessary regulations to charity functions. My staff started counting votes and realized we were one short of passing the proposal. 2 swing votes were worried about pushback from the business community, who funded many city initiatives. I needed to find a compromise that kept the core protections while addressing their concerns about overregulation. The Business Association sent a formal letter opposing the policy that same day. They warned that donors might stop supporting city-partnered events if we imposed strict behavioral requirements. Their counter-proposal suggested voluntary guidelines that organizations could choose to adopt rather than mandatory rules. They attached a list of major donors who were reconsidering their support for upcoming city projects. My deputy organized a town hall for that weekend where constituents could share their experiences with harassment at civic events. We sent invitations to every neighborhood group and posted notices on all city social media channels. The response was immediate, with over 200 people signing up to attend or submit written statements. Saturday morning, the auditorium filled with residents wanting to tell their stories. A teacher described being groped at a school fundraiser by a donor who said she should be grateful for his support. A nonprofit director shared how a board member had propositioned her during a charity auction. A young professional talked about leaving a networking event after an older businessman wouldn't stop touching her shoulders and hair. Each story built pressure on the council members who were watching from the back row. People weren't just sharing what happened to them, but explaining how it affected their willingness to participate in civic life. Several women said they'd stopped attending city events entirely because they didn't feel safe. The personal testimonies made it harder for critics to dismiss this as one politician's personal grievance. The local news covered the town hall extensively, interviewing participants and broadcasting their stories across the evening news cycle. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from council members who were starting to reconsider their positions on the code of conduct proposal. Monday morning, my deputy walked into my office with a folder and a weird look on her face. She'd gotten a call from someone on the hospital board who wanted me to know they'd voted to remove Robert from their donor advisory committee while they reviewed what happened at the fundraiser. The vote happened over the weekend in a closed session, and they weren't making it public yet, but the board member thought I should know they were taking it seriously. I grabbed my coffee and started reading through the weekend emails when my assistant knocked and said the city attorney needed to see me immediately. She walked in carrying a thick envelope that had been delivered by courier 20 minutes earlier. Robert's lawyer had sent a cease and desist letter threatening to sue me for defamation, unless I publicly retracted everything I'd said at the fundraiser, and apologized for damaging his reputation. The letter went on for 12 pages, listing all the ways I'd supposedly lied about what happened, and calculating damages at $2 million. My city attorney sat down and started pulling out witness statements she'd already collected from people at the event. She had signed affidavits from 3 servers who heard Robert's comments about women's brains. Plus, the audio tech had saved a recording from the venue's system that caught most of our conversation, including him grabbing my phone. We spent 2 hours going through every claim in the letter and documenting exactly what evidence we had to prove I'd told the truth. The city attorney leaned back in her chair and suggested we try mediation before this turned into a long, expensive court battle that would drain city resources and dominate headlines for months. She thought we could use the threat of our evidence to push for something that would actually help prevent future harassment at city events. I agreed to explore mediation, but only if any agreement included funding for real training programs, not just Robert writing a check to make this go away. 3 days later, we sat in a conference room at a downtown law firm with Robert's legal team and a retired judge acting as mediator. Robert wasn't there, but his lawyers made it clear he wanted this resolved quickly and quietly to protect his business interests. I pushed hard for his foundation to fund harassment prevention training at every city-partnered event for the next 5 years. The lawyers kept trying to water it down to optional workshops or online modules, but I held firm that it had to be mandatory in-person training for all staff and volunteers. After 6 hours of back and forth, We reached a tentative agreement where Robert's foundation would provide $300,000 over 5 years for training programs. He wouldn't have to admit any wrongdoing, and both sides would agree not to make any more public statements about the incident. It wasn't the public accountability I wanted, but it would create real change at dozens of events each year. The council meeting was scheduled for Thursday night, and my deputy's vote count showed we were still one short even after the town hall. We spent Wednesday calling the 2 swing votes trying to address their concerns about the business community pulling support. I offered to add language requiring due process for anyone accused of violations, including the right to appeal, and a clear investigation procedure. One council member finally agreed to support it if we changed mandatory removal to a review process where event organizers could decide appropriate consequences based on severity. Thursday night, the council chambers were packed with people wearing pins supporting the code of conduct. The debate went on for 3 hours with business leaders warning about economic impacts and assault survivors sharing why these protections mattered. When they finally called the vote, it passed 5-4 after we'd added the due process protections the swing vote wanted. I watched the vote board light up and felt relief until my phone started buzzing with texts from my deputy. 3 major donors had already sent emails pulling their support from the new youth center, the library expansion, and the park renovation project. We'd known there would be backlash, but losing almost $1 million in pledged funding meant scrambling to find new sources or scaling back projects that the community was counting on. Friday morning, I locked myself in my office bathroom and felt my chest getting tight as everything from the past 2 weeks hit me at once. My hands were shaking and I couldn't catch my breath as I slid down against the door, realizing how much this fight had taken out of me. I sat on the cold tile floor for 20 minutes trying to calm down before calling my deputy to cancel my afternoon meetings. That weekend, I made an appointment with a counselor and started delegating more responsibilities to my senior staff, who'd been asking to take on bigger roles anyway. The following week, a reporter from the state's biggest newspaper called saying she was working on a story about sexism in local politics across the region. She'd been following what happened at the fundraiser and wanted to connect it to similar incidents in other cities where female officials faced harassment at public events. Her article ran that Sunday with interviews from 8 female mayors and city council members who'd dealt with similar behavior but hadn't felt safe speaking up before. The piece helped people understand this wasn't just about one bad interaction, but a pattern that kept qualified women out of public service. That same morning, I got an email from the hospital's board president saying they'd exceeded their fundraising goal thanks to last-minute donations after the event. However, they were reconsidering whether to invite city officials to future fundraisers to avoid any distractions from their mission of helping sick kids. Monday morning, my deputy walked into my office holding her phone and showing me a news article about Robert's construction company losing their contract with the city's parks department. The contract was only worth $200,000 a year, so it wasn't going to hurt him much, but seeing his company name next to words like controversy felt like something. His company put out a press release that same afternoon announcing 3 new contracts with private developers worth 10 times what they'd lost from us. Money really does protect people from consequences because while regular folks would lose their jobs over grabbing someone's face, Robert just shifted his business focus. The ethics complaint he'd filed against me sat on my desk for 6 weeks while the city attorney's office investigated every single claim he'd made. They interviewed 17 people who'd been at the fundraiser and reviewed all the video footage from 3 different angles. Every witness confirmed what happened, and the video showed him grabbing my phone, my wrist, and my face without permission. The investigator called me Thursday afternoon to say they were dismissing the complaint completely since there was 0 evidence I'd done anything wrong. I hung up the phone and sat quietly in my office, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders after weeks of paperwork and meetings. My inbox kept filling with emails from people either praising me for standing up or calling me unprofessional for making a scene. The angry ones worried me less than the ones that included specific threats about what they'd do if they saw me alone. Security started checking my car every morning and walking me to every public event, even if it was just across the street. We installed panic buttons in my office and started screening all visitors through metal detectors, which made everything take longer. The hospital board president called asking if we could meet privately to discuss how to move forward without more drama. We sat in a quiet coffee shop where nobody recognized us and talked for 2 hours about what went wrong. He admitted they should have stepped in when Robert was touching me, but they were scared of losing his donations. We agreed on new standards for all future events, including trained staff who would intervene if anyone was harassed. I started bringing my deputy or another staff member to every single event, even small ribbon cuttings and school visits. They'd stand close enough to step in if needed, but far enough to let me do my job normally. It wasn't how I wanted to work, but after getting grabbed at what should have been a safe fundraiser, I couldn't risk it. The first training session funded by Robert's Foundation happened on a Tuesday morning at the community center. 30 event organizers showed up to learn about recognizing harassment and how to intervene safely without causing scenes. A woman who'd been assaulted at a work conference led the session and centered everything on protecting victims while maintaining professional environments. Watching people take notes and ask real questions about keeping their events safe made all the fights worth it. 3 months passed, and I found myself feeling different about my role as mayor than I had before. The criticism still came daily, but I'd learned to separate the valid feedback from the noise. More women started reaching out to share their own stories about being grabbed or talked down to at professional events. Some thanked me for speaking up, while others wished I'd been quieter to avoid giving ammunition to people who already thought women couldn't lead. My staff noticed I was more careful at events, but also more confident when dealing with difficult people. The hospital's spring fundraiser was coming up again, and I hadn't decided whether to attend or skip it entirely. My deputy brought me a letter that had arrived at City Hall addressed to me personally with no return address. Inside was neat handwriting from a 23-year-old woman who'd watched the live stream of what happened with Robert. She wrote that she'd been considering running for city council, but thought she was too young and inexperienced. Seeing me refuse to stay quiet when someone literally grabbed my face made her realize that if I could handle that, she could handle campaign criticism. She'd filed her paperwork to run and already had 50 volunteers signed up to help with her campaign. Reading her letter reminded me that sometimes the fights we don't want to have end up mattering to people we'll never meet. That's a wrap for now. Thanks for just hanging out and exploring all these little details with me. Until next time, subscribe for more content like this.